First of all, may I welcome all members to the special meeting of the Panel on Constitutional Affairs. It is time and we have a quorum. I call to order the meeting. Item 1 on the agenda, consultation paper on review of electoral arrangements. This is in fact a meeting with the administration and deputations. May I first of all invite the administration and also the deputations to join us here. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, for each representative attending meeting, you have 3 minutes to speak. If you have not submitted your written submissions to us, you could do so after the meeting. Please pass it on to our Secretariat. May I remind you who are giving your views here, the submissions you make here do not enjoy the protection and exemption under the Legislative Council Powers and Privileges Ordinance. And also, your submissions are not covered by this ordinance. And I'd like to remind you too that you could use the earpiece and the microphone. Channel 0, floor, Channel 1 Cantonese, Channel 2 English, and Channel 3 Putonghua. And please also pay attention to the note for members of the public attending meetings in conference rooms or observing meetings in public galleries in the Legislative Council complex. The note has been attached to the letter issued to you by the Secretariat. The note is also tabled. And for those in public gallery, you could ask for a copy from the security staff. Now I will invite you all to speak, and afterwards I will invite Mr. Andy Chen, Under Secretary for Constitutional and Mainland Affairs, to respond. So, first of all, now I will invite the deputations to speak. First one, Mr. Y. Good afternoon, Merry Christmas. Yesterday I went to the elderly home to cheer them up, and 20 years ago I was a social worker. Now some groups came to visit our elderly persons and help them to register for the elderly card, but then they found out they were also registered as voters without knowing it. This is against the law, of course. At the ICAC annual press conference today, Ms. Maritime also said that the election must be kept clean. And yesterday, the elderly people told me, don't, bus me over to the polling station. For example, the mother of Chen Chi-kun, now she's not mentally sound, and then she was pushed to cast her vote. Now, as the Secretary for welfare said, Labor and Welfare said that, by 2025 I'll be 100 years old. Now, usually district council election is held in November, and if a person is 100-year-old and you push him or her to cast her vote, what if they die as a result? So don't do that to the elderly. And some elderly people told me yesterday they didn't want to do that. And then recently, there's a mention of replacing the identity cards, and now that's really scary. And then yesterday at the NPC election, you know, so someone who lost the computers was elected, so it's scary. And I've been seeing all this dirty business about voting. Now, even now, I could walk there and see the register, and I can see which elderly person hasn't been sent over yet to cast a vote. I'll be able to tell, and I could go and take that elderly over. And with latest technology, with your spectacles, you could take pictures. Now, because I'm not able to see what's on the list there, and maybe I'll see Granny A, Granny B, Granny C are not yet here yet, so I will bust them over. So this is collapse of rules and order, and this is really outrageous. Then yesterday, the elderly people told me, don't do that to me again. And for ID card, well, for these elderly people, they are, you know, in the twilight years. What if you give them the new chip? Can you just put it in the chip that I'm not going to vote? So with advanced technology, then if it's already in the ID card, and if someone pushes that old person to cast a vote, then you should take that person to jail, or send him to jail. You know, for ID cards, there are 8.8 million ID cards, but 8 million aren't Hong Kong people.
Next, Mr. LegCo. First of all, I am an electoral member who has been disqualified. I think Mr. Chen, the Secretary, has not considered the issue of the confirmation letter. I think the by-election is going to take place very soon. And there is legal proceeding going on for the results of the three constituencies. The election results are still pending. Many of us are not able to recover our election expenses. So when are you going to resolve this problem? When people you know, made a submission saying that the confirmation letter is unconstitutional, and you didn't bother to give an answer. You disqualify members. That is myself, and so I would like to know whether you are the government or not. Because of the issue of the confirmation letter, this was in July 2016, and the members were disqualified in October in 2016. So what exactly are you doing? Are you really a government? How can you be so sloppy if you do not tackle this problem? If Mr. Leung Tin Kei and the other member, you know, if the petition were entertained, then there will be 3 by-elections. And what is Mr. Nip, the Secretary, doing? He used to be with the Environment, Food and Environment Bureau, and you at the Transport and Housing Bureau. So how do you operate? Don't think that I'm no longer, just because I'm no longer a LegCo member, I will not criticize you. I'm asking, what is your plan, and what legal proceedings does the DFJ, the Secretary of Justice, have to take care of? When you were very serious when the rules of procedure were changed in LegCo, you said you respected this council. So I'd like to know when you're going to do it. When would there be, you know, a decision? And it's dragged on for so long. Why is it that when people challenge you and say that the confirmation letter is unconstitutional, do you have any plans to change that, or are you going to, you know, apply for a temporary injunction from the court to ban people from taking part in the election? Because the basic law stipulates, Article 27, it stipulates that everybody has a right to vote and to be elected. January the 1st, there will be a rally at Tung Kok Road. I'm asking the people of Hong Kong to ask you the same question. So do you have any justification? You came up with the confirmation letter in July, and now, so I'm sorry, Mr. Leung, I think we will need to let the next deputation to speak. Mr. Yang Qing-on, thank you. On behalf of the Liberal Party, I'd like to welcome the government consultation on the review of the electoral arrangements. The electoral system is changing all the time. Many things are already outdated. In 2015-2016, there were many issues during the election, including the publication of the opinion poll results. I think we must review that, including the polls conducted within and outside the no canvassing zone. In the past, some academics would conduct some poll results and they would announce the findings, on the internet. I think they are, blatantly challenging the electoral system. It is a duty and a right of the citizens to vote, and I don't think we need to really for example, publish all these results and then try to manipulate the votes in order to manipulate the votes and allocate votes to the benefit of certain candidates. So the Liberal Party therefore welcomed the review of the arrangement, especially the review regarding the opinion polls and also the cooling off period. And during that cooling off period, people are not allowed to announce, for example, the findings of polls or, for example, the results of the exit polls, because that would affect the people's the way people will vote and preferences. At the Hong Kong polling station, all of a sudden, after the news was broadcast, just before the gate was closed, 600 people came out to vote. And the polling station was so overcrowded that the counting of votes actually lasted until 2:30 in the morning. So I don't think this is something that should have happened in a well-developed society. Of course, the government is saying that such arrangement would mean that the staff will have to work longer and so on. Well, I don't agree. But if you allow the polling stations to allow people to incite the voters and to match votes, in a strategic manner, that would not be fair. So the Liberal Party believes that this has to be reviewed. But we don't have any view regarding the timetable. And I also think that there should be a cooling off period for the forthcoming election. Last month, I have to wait until 1:30 in the morning before a fax came, and we couldn't even see the results, and it was then that the result was announced. So I think we really need to actually improve on the whole electoral procedure. Mr. Lochin. Well, I hold a different view. I do not welcome the review conducted by the Bureau. I think if you have read the Constitution paper, what exactly is the crux of the matter? It is that we want to ensure that the voters can reflect their views and preferences, and there are different ways for them to reflect their views. In Hong Kong, we have a proportional representation system, and under this system there is an element of strategic voting. And strategic voting reflects people's choice. Robert Dow, in his book, said that at the time of voting, the voter is exercising his expression of preference. And I think strategic voting exists. I think for people from different political parties, you can ask yourself whether or not you've been engaged in the matching of votes. This is part of the system. You can't say that we will now ban opinion poll. That would actually mean that we are refusing to admit the reality. If you don't allow people to announce the findings of the poll result, people will still vote. But what is important is that on polling day, You talk about the cooling off period, you only told part of the story. On a cooling day, it means that in any election or electioneering work should cease. But in your review, you say that you will only ban people from conducting polls. I think in your constitution paper, you like to manipulate the findings of the study to obtain the results that you would like to achieve. And you use Singapore as an example. Singapore is an authoritarian society. Are you saying that in Hong Kong we should also, learn from the example? In para 3.10 and 11, you talk about the cooling off period. You only, copy half of the example, and you also talk about shortening the timetable. Now we don't have any arrangement for citizens in Hong Kong to vote overseas. Some people actually take a flight back to Hong Kong to vote. If you shorten the voting hours, you are further restricting the right. Next, Mr. Lee Manjin. I would like to express my views on the constitution paper on behalf of the DP. Basically, there are 3 points in dissemination of results on the internet and election expenses and so on. Now, first of all, publishing election advertisements on the internet. We think that the public has the right to express any opinion for or against any particular candidates. And I think we should allow them to freely express their views. And also, this is not really a nuisance, and it is not necessary to regulate such activities. We therefore support what is suggested in the consultation paper. Regarding the regulation of electoral polls, I think we should divide this into 2 parts. That is polling day and the period before the polling day. On polling day, I think it is an open secret that the pro-government camp will commission polling organizations to obtain some findings to help them, conduct strategic, polling. And usually at 4 or 5 p.m. you would have, voters being sent to the polling stations to vote. But according to in your constitution paper, you gave the examples of 5 countries. Singapore, you have the PAP, which is the predominant party. And they do not allow the announcement of election results on polling day. In New Zealand, they allow the citizens to cast votes before polling day, which means that if they have announced the findings of opinion polls, it might affect the result of the election. But in Hong Kong, it's not the case. We only have more than 10 odd hours on election day for people to vote, and therefore there's no need for you to restrict, polling opinion polls before election. On the voting hours, we do not agree that we should shorten the polling hours. According to the paper, I think the voters will come to the polling station to vote, and they are evenly spread out. If for some polling stations, if you cannot surrender the polling station before 6, then you should make use of the community halls or use larger polling stations to count the votes. And on the cooling off period, the constitution period has not touched on that too much. In 2014, some pro-government camps actually pushed the elderly ladies to polling stations.
Next, Mr. LegCo. I represent the Civic Party. Now, in the consultation paper, it covers 3 topics. One is election advertisements published through the internet, regulation with election surveys, and polling hours. Polling hours in the consultation document is mentioned that the government considers the polling hours to be too long, and it also takes time to count the votes. So for the polling station staff and the candidates and their teams, they all have to work long hours, and also results are announced rather late. Yes, we think perhaps the current arrangement may make it more difficult for the government to get people to let them use the venues, but then we don't think we should shorten the polling hours. I don't think the government should sacrifice the rights of the voters because of administrative expedience. So maybe the government could deploy more staff to shorten the counting duration. As for regulation of advertisements on the internet, now the guidelines were issued in 2016. So with regard to the publication of advertisements, that is the publication of other people's information may be regarded as advertisements, but the guidelines are rather vague, and what is a person's view and what is considered advertisement. There is no objective delineation by the Electoral Affairs Commission. Now, it's common for people just to leave a comment on social media platform, or maybe the picture of the Facebook account is changed, and then there may be more people being added as friends, and would that be regarded as advertisement? I think it's an outdated way to regulate such practices. And what about counting the cost of putting that online, and that counts towards the election expenses of the candidate, and that's outrageous. So the Civic Party agrees that we should exempt counting the use of electricity or internet data charges, because then netizens don't have to worry that they're just giving views and then somehow it's considered election expense, and then we're talking about small sum anyway. So this will allow candidates to compete fairly, and we can ensure the fairness of election. Finally, on the regulation of election surveys. For polling station surveys, I think the biggest accusation is not that the media are trying to influence the results, but rather there are political groups using or engaging organizations to do surveys for their own election strategy. Oh, your time is up. Next, please, Mr. Yao Yu-chung. Thank you. I'm a student. So I would like to talk about this document from the point of view of a student. First, on polling hours. The government would like to shorten the hours, but I am not in favor of shortening the polling hours. Why? The first reason is I hope the government understands this. It is the right of the public as to when they go to cast their vote. Now, from the paper, we see that in the last hour, in the 2016 LegCo election, we see that in the last hour, there was the highest turnout rate of voters. So some members, some believe that we should just leave out that hour because it may affect your vote counting. But when you do your vote counting, could there be another way to do it so it could be more efficient? So you should consider enhancing the efficiency of counting instead of shortening the polling hours. I have observed how counting was done. You do it manually, but would you consider making the process electronic? It may be much faster. And about the election surveys on the voters' preferences. Well, as was mentioned just now, vote matching is only normal. You can't accuse the Democratic camp for engaging in vote matching. But it's possible that the pro-establishment camp also does the same. So it's not a fair accusation. Now I'm running out of time, so now I want to talk about issues not covered by the paper. First of all, would the government consider stepping up regulation over the use of ID card copy for casting votes? Because people may just take someone else's ID card. So the government hasn't mentioned anything. Please pay attention to that. That's the first point. Second point, I don't think elections are fair in Hong Kong. We have functional constituencies. So some people are elected without any votes cast for them. And also when you don't like someone, you could disqualify others. As the government, well, this is not right, so would you consider relaxing that? Thank you. Next, Mr. Anman Yu. Thank you. Well, the paper is on 3 issues, so I would like to comment on those 3 issues on behalf of the DAB. First, about election advertisements published through the internet. We support the proposal in the document, because then people who since we're just giving their views on the internet won't be caught inadvertently. Maybe they just comment on a particular candidate, or then it's not it's not the case that the person is advertising that will influence the election results. And second point about regulating election surveys. Now, for outside no canvassing zone, surveys may be carried out, and before the polling days, when surveys are carried out, should they all be regulated? And is it a change over the current practice? Now, for surveys done outside the no canvassing zone, there is no regulation. The government will also consider whether there is election expense incurred. If so, then there's regulation. Otherwise, the government does not regulate that. In the 2016 LegCo election, there was this operation to collect data from surveys and then influence and then try to match votes. It causes unfairness in election. So they try to use election survey results to convince certain candidates to stop their electioneering activities and so on. So there is a problem to do that with doing that. So the government should regulate surveys so people can't use survey findings to manipulate elections. This is to ensure the fairness of election. Thirdly, on polling hours, the hours should be to facilitate the public, so there shouldn't be any major change. For example, you can just shorten the polling hours, say, by 30 minutes, and you should allow voters to adjust to the new polling hours before you incrementally shorten the polling hours. And also, if voting is closed earlier, then people will find out about the polling results earlier. And also, there will be less nuisance cost to the neighborhood. Thank you. Next, Mr. Wu Parkland. Thank you. I represent Dynamic Island. I'm not happy with this meeting arrangement. On the seating plan, the English version, the names of the organizations are not included there because I'm not here representing myself at my organization, so please take note of that. And I also see no representatives from the Home Affairs Department. Now, this is about elections, including rural election and so on. I don't know if there's anyone from the Home Affairs Department here, but I don't see him on the list. Now, I'd like to speak on the consultation paper. I'm glad that the government has relaxed the regulation of advertisements published through the internet. So for general public, those who are not election agents, expense agents, if they just disseminate information about the election, they won't be caught inadvertently by the law after this relaxation. So I support that. And then on election surveys and polling hours, it seems the government has already got a sense on these issues in organizing the consultation. Now, I found that the government has repeatedly criticized certain arrangements, saying that they are not reasonable or unlawful, so they should be subjected to regulation. But as others who have spoken mentioned, I don't see any problems with that, with the publication of election survey findings. But rather, the government is not making enough arrangement in terms of operation. Now, my group was involved in election survey commissioned by someone, but we were put inside a locked room in carrying out the election survey. Yeah, you're already regulating where we could do our surveys, but actually that's unreasonable because I'm not able to reach out to the voters. We couldn't seek their views, and then you put the three of us in doing the survey in a locked room. This is really totally unacceptable. And on polling hours, I'm opposed to shortening polling hours. Polling hours are meant to facilitate the public so they could vote. If you think certain candidates think that they say that they cannot observe the voting late at night, the counting late at night, is not right, because the candidates, if they are elected, they are there to serve the residents. Now, the government picks these three subjects for the public consultation. I think the scope is far too narrow, because you are only picking out certain practices that do not favor certain parties. What about $14 per vote, the election deposit, the eligibility, and other operational arrangements, and so on? I think there should also be reviewed. If there is time, then please allow me to speak again later. Thank you. That would be great. Next, Mr. Yip Kam Long. Now, I don't want to thank this chairman to start with. I would like to represent my local residents and share with you some experience. In the 2015 District Council election, I ran for election at Sek Tong Chui. Some residents told me at 5 p.m. all of a sudden they received calls from some candidates who were not running in that constituency. They asked the voters who they supported, and letters were also put in letter boxes with the name of an organization on the letters. But then eventually I was told that for that letter is not declared as election advertisement, and also these residents did not know how come their phone numbers, if someone got hold of their phone numbers, maybe only because they've signed up for some hobby classes before. Anyway, so there's a lot of speculation in the community. Is it possible that there are certain, polling organizations, I won't name names, perhaps they although they have signed certain declaration, for some reason their particulars are leaked to a certain source. Now we read this consultation document, we learn that our laws do not regulate how the surveying bodies carry the surveys, and what if they breach the code. You say there will be certain criminal liabilities, but is there any? Maybe there isn't, but so have you considered it? Because in other countries, there could be a criminal offense. Now, of course, you need to review, you need to move with the times, but very often this government doesn't move with the times. On the one hand, you're saying that we must regulate this, that, and the other, and on the other, you have withheld all bills which are all about urgent people's livelihood issues. So, so as to facilitate the pro-establishment camp to totally destroy this rules of procedure. So this is unreasonable. And then in the document, you also mentioned that the polling hours should be shortened because everyone becomes very tired. Yes, I know. I run an election. I was also a counting agent. Yes, I'm tired, but it's fine. You say it's difficult to find venues. It's actually not that difficult either. There's just one thing you need to do for the polling day and the day after. You declare them to be public holidays of Hong Kong, then you won't have any problems hiring venues. And for civil service staff, there won't be a problem of them having to go to work the following day, and then they could all take good rest, and that will resolve the matter. And you could actually revamp the whole voting process and make it electronic. Thank you.
Mr. Tai Chi-fei, Chairman. I represent the Hong Kong University's polling department. The director of WAPO Asia, Mr. Robert Chung, has also already put in a written submission. I'd like to summarize his submission. The consultation paper asked whether or not we should ban election polls outside the polling station. I think we should actually follow international standard. And I think the guidelines should stipulate, lay down requirements for the professional responsibilities of the polling organization, and that they should not use the exit poll results for electioneering. And regulating polling exit polls will actually, well, according to the expert, that is said that we should not ban such according to Professor Wolfgang Dossmann, we shouldn't ban that, and because otherwise people will use unscrupulous means to achieve certain targets, and then Hong Kong will become less and less democratic. Secondly, turning Hong Kong into a smart city will only be empty talk. Some members said that tightening regulation would help to eliminate vote matching, but I think this is due to is not due to the lack of information. The more information we have, the fairer will be the election. Thirdly, regulating the circulation information will result in unfair election. Under the current system, using data collected at polling station for electioneering is already well known. And there's no way at the moment to ban certain organizations for using these polling results for the election campaign. So I think we should. So this would actually this would not result in a fair election. So any regulation of the election arrangement is not acceptable. If there be any regulation, we should do it under the following principles. That is, the less regulation, the better. There should be more flow of information. And thirdly, the poll should be conducted by professional polling organizations. Looking at Hong Kong, China, Macau, and China don't have democratic election yes in Taiwan. Announcement of polling result before the election day is not allowed. Hong Kong being the most democratic the freest society, we should be proud of our free tradition. We shouldn't give up. Thank you. So we've now finished with the deputations, and we will now invite the Secretary the Under Secretary, Mr. Chan, to respond to the deputations. We're scheduled to finish at 4:15. Mr. Chan, could you give us an overall response? Thank you. I'd like to thank members and the deputations for attending this deputation. I'd like to thank the Secretariat for arranging for I'd like to thank you for all your inputs on these important issues. The three issues is, first of all, election advertisements. Secondly, the exit poll, and thirdly, the polling hours. regarding election advertisements, especially on the internet and on social media. Third parties may actually post their personal opinion, and this could be regarded as election advertisements and thus attracting a legal liability. I've heard many views today favoring our proposal that we should provide exemptions for members of the public, so because they would frequently use such instruments to express the opinion, and we need to ensure that they will not inadvertently, break the law, and what they put on the internet will be regarded as election advertisement. On polling studies, since when we look at the elections in the last 3 years, I think there have been heated discussion as to whether or not we should regulate such election surveys. And some deputations already pointed out the justification for regulation, namely the election should be fair, we shouldn't affect the decision of the voters. And there had also been other views saying that you cannot regulate, you shouldn't be any regulation. People should be allowed to freely express their views, and vote matching is being done anyway. The government has an open attitude, and we don't have any position. And that is the whole purpose of the public consultation. Ever since we released the consultation paper on October 13, we have received many feedback. At the last meeting of this panel, we've also heard the first round of opinion from members. Having heard the deputations today, and after we've heard the deputations today, by the end of the consultation period, we will collate all the views collected, and then we will compile the report, which will be, and we'll also come to this panel to inform members of the result. On polling hours, I'd like to first of all state the facts and what are our considerations. From the consultation paper, you would have noticed that I think Hong Kong is one of the jurisdictions with the longest polling hours, 15 hours. And we've adopted the same polling hours during all previous elections. And all the candidates and all the voters are used to this arrangement. Whether or not we can change it, we are actually bringing this up for discussion so that the whole community can consider together whether we can change this arrangement. It's difficult to change a habit, but on the other hand, habits can be changed. Throughout the world, we've seen other jurisdictions where it's possible to have shorter hours. So in the end, it all boils down to a question of habit and whether or not we need to change that habit. In the paper, we've already outlined the justification. For example, it's true that mistakes will be more easily made, and if we close the polling station later and start counting the vote, then afterwards, then the results can only be announced later. Shortening the polling hours would mean that it will take less time to count the votes. But if you don't want to change the polling hours because we're used to this, well, that is also a justification because it's a habit. If you say the voters are used to this habit, and I think so long as the rules are clear and we act according to the regulations and do our part as a citizen, it is both our right and our obligation. And I don't think it's that difficult to change. Changing a habit is difficult, but as whether or not we can have minor changes, I don't think we should rule it out entirely. We have an open mind on this issue, but if we slightly change this habit, is it really that terrible? as of course people have concerns and worries. That is only natural. I've heard some deputations expressing concerns about this. We hope that after the consultation we will be able to collate all the views collected and it will come to a decision. Thank you. Next, we will now it is now time for members to ask questions. First of all, read out the names of those members who would like to ask questions. Helena Wong, Claudia Mo, Slam Chek Ting. If other members would like to speak, Mr. Eddie G, you may still put up your hands. I will allow 4 minutes to each member, question and answers included. So let's see whether after the first round we can go for a second round. For the first round, we'll start with Dr. Helena Wong. I'd like to thank the deputations for expressing the views today. I have 3 questions for the administration to follow up. First of all, some deputations pointed out that in homes for the elderly, some elderly residents are forcibly taken out to vote. While we encourage people to vote, we shouldn't force people to vote against their will. So I'd like to know how common is this kind of practices. Has the government conducted a study into this, or do you have a blacklist as to whether there are certain homes for the elderly, or where persons within such homes or persons in charge are condoning or encouraging such conduct? I believe there should be code of conduct for them. How did you deal with the situations like that in the past, and going forward, how are you going to ensure that such conduct will not take place again? Secondly, I've read Robert Chung's submission. His accusation is that the polling station data has been secretly used for electioneering purpose. I think Dr. Chung is also very experienced in this, and he is saying that the government cannot stop people using such data for electioneering purpose. Now, when you conduct exit polls on election day, what measures do you have to ensure that the latest polling data will not be used for secret electioneering purposes? Mr. Wu mentioned that when he was conducting such election polls, he was locked up in a room and he was not able to release the data. I don't know what this is related. So what measures does the government have to ensure that this will not happen? Or is it like what Mr. Robert Chung said, this is already a common practice and there's nothing you can do about it? If you cannot regulate this at all, why don't you simply give everybody a free hand to disseminate information? And thirdly, it has been suggested that there should be professional codes of conduct for those who are involved in exit polls, and these organizations should need to follow these regulations, and they should be subject to professional supervision. So I'd like to know what plans the administration have in those regards. Thank you. Dr. Wong raised 3 points. I'll start and then I'll ask the EAC to supplement. Regarding senior citizens being forcibly taken to vote, the gentleman who raised this point is not in his chamber. I understand that he's Mr. White, who was wearing a hat and a mask. He didn't give details regarding such cases. I would like to appeal to him that if you have any details, you should report to the law enforcement authorities, because it is illegal to force people, to compel people to vote. So we would like to have the details. And so will you conduct investigation proactively to see whether or not this is actually taking place in the homes of the elderly? you need to have a case first before there can be any investigation. If there is, of course, we will investigate. Secondly, the opinion poll, the polling center suggested that the data collected in the polling studies could be used for secret electioneering. So, but the government does have regulation regarding exit polls. And the organization conducting such polls will need to sign a legal undertaking and promise that they will not, before the end of the election, disseminate the results of the election poll. If they violate such a declaration, there will be legal consequences. So we do have regulation here, and of course they will need to be registered beforehand. Regarding codes for the profession, we would also welcome the polling organizations to come up with such codes.
Can I follow up, please? So the government does not know whether people comply with the declarations. There's no way you can monitor that. Is that right? Dr. Wong, you've exceeded your time limit. There may be a second round, so please let another member speak first. Next to Ms. Claudia Mo. June last year, Mr. Christopher Chung of the DAB declared loudly that in another round of the LegCo election at 6 p.m. For the polling station, the DAB said no need to vote for DAB members. Instead, matched votes to Wong Kwok Heng of the FTU. The DAB denied it. The DAB said that it did not conduct any election surveys. Well, you didn't have to do it yourselves. I don't know who did it. And for our operation, it's not us or any of our political parties asking to do that. But then you are saying that it is such arrangement is totally inappropriate or whatever. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's Yip Kok Him or Sari Lee. You never said that Christopher Chung was lying. So that's a very important point to bear in mind. Now, for the polling station, you said the declaration was signed, but then I don't know who I would ask to do it because it's an academic study. But then maybe my friends want to know about the results. So how would you know if the results have been given to that relevant party on the polling day, and so they could match votes? So there's no way you could control anything here. So why bother? Answer, please. Under Secretary? Well, we never advocated that it should be done one way or the other in the consultation paper. We just observed the exchanges, the exchanges in the community. That's why we wanted to consult. Okay, fine. I want to go back about elderly homes, and vote matching. Now, there was a news clip showing that the elderly women were taken to vote for a certain candidate number. And I took that photo, I took that clip, and I actually lodged a complaint formally. But then the granny, was old, and her family member didn't want any troubles. I could fully understand it anyway. So there's no... Nothing led from the investigation led to nothing, or the complaint led to nothing. But I mean, you have seen the clips yourself. Wouldn't you take the initiative to investigate? Why didn't you? Any response, please? Ms. Mo or Dr. Wong mentioned problem. Now, if that's true, definitely it's against the Election Illegal and Corrupt Practices Ordinance, and the ICAC is the law enforcement agency of this piece of legislation. If the ICAC receives any information, it carries out investigation and so on. Well, the ICAC needs witnesses. I mentioned that the old lady, she's too old and her family member didn't want trouble. Do you know what I'm talking about? But I think you could look into that yourself. What elderly home was that? Why this happened? Because people were able to capture the footage. Answer. You're using up my time. The REO, do you have any response? No, really, because the investigation power rests with the ICAC. So it's up to the ICAC to decide how to conduct investigation. Our registration election office is not a law enforcement agency. Well, then you have to give us a response bureau. Now, I haven't watched that clip. But I'm sure if you try to be submitted, you have submitted the footage to the department, and I'll find out what the follow-up was like. No, it's not me. I don't have to submit the footage. It's in the public domain. You could find it even now if you want. Okay, yes, we'll go and search for that footage. If I can't find it, I will. Yes, if you can't find it, do contact me. Make sure you contact me. Yes, I will pass on the footage to the law enforcement agency. Next, Mr. Lam Chak Ting. Mr. Amin Yu, the chairman of Young DAB, has left, unfortunately, but Horace Chung is here. Good, and you're the chairman, so I won't target you. Now, regulating election surveys, you have the nerve to say that. The DAB complains about that. You have done so many exit polls yourself. Christopher Chung admitted it in the commercial radio program. He said that Zhang Yuxing don't canvass for votes anymore. The votes must be given to the FTUY because we did exit polls. And then the commercial radio host asked, but the DAB did not register to conduct exit polls. It was all captured in recording, and you still deny it? The DAB does so many exit polls, and using this Hong Kong Institute of Surveys, everybody knows about it, and then you use those data for vote matching. And then there is this Thunder Go operation in the community to match votes, and you say this must be regulated, and you have the nerve to say that it has to be regulated, honestly. Now, and the government, how come you're only raising it now? Because for a long time we've asked you to regulate this practice by the pro-establishment camp to match votes, and you never said a word. Now, because of the Thunder Go operation and because the pro-establishment camp said something, now you propose to regulate the election surveys. So you only allow the pro-establishment camp to match votes. You don't allow others to abandon their campaign. Honestly, how dare you? Because all these years you have turned a blind eye to such practices by the pro-establishment camp. This Hong Kong Institute doing survey has a strong pro-establishment background, and now you want to regulate election surveys. So if that's the case, then maybe you shouldn't allow election surveys. I'm not in favor of that, though. I think we should allow election surveys. Hong Kong U commands so much public authority that you should let them do it. Why are you laughing, Horace Chung? I'm sure people will have more trust. Do you ask the people in Hong Kong, do they trust Robert Tai or you? I think we all know the answers. Under Secretary. Well, I heard Mr. Justin Lam say that he's not in support of regulating election surveys, so that means this session is working. We're able to hear views. What about Christopher Chung openly admitted that DAB matched votes? Well, if that's in the public domain, you would have all read about it. I have nothing to add. That's why I say it's not fair. You don't even dare to say it's not allowed. You say you have nothing to add. You have no information to add. but you are the Undersecretary of Constitution for Constitutional Mainland Affairs. You dare not comment on the fairness and of election. You dare not mention the legislation. That's why people think it's unfair. You see something so unfair, you just turn a blind eye to it. And then if others mention the Sunday Go complaining that it's not fair, then you now decide you want to regulate it. So how dare you tell us about fairness of election? Mr. Fu Chen, well, I think he's misunderstood this whole issue. The consultation paper has not advocated banning election service. I'm talking about Christopher Chong's footage. I'm not asking about election service. Why don't you answer me? Holden Chow, you can't interrupt. Well, I'm chairing this meeting, so I have the duty to remind members of the rules. You asked him to answer my question. Undersecretary, please answer the question. So as the chairman, I have the duty to remind members. Today's discussion topic is about the review document. It's about the consultation paper on review of electoral arrangements, which mainly has to do with the regulation of EAs published through the internet, shortening polling hours and so on. But if you digress to other issues, I'm talking about exit polls. A part of that is about surveys. Is it that because we talk about the DAB, you won't allow it? No, that's why I'm asking the Undersecretary to reply. No, I'm talking about this. I'm within the scope of this subject, and you say I'm digressing, so I'm not allowed to say that. So if not, just shut up. Holden Chow. Undersecretary, would you respond, please? On exit polls. Now, the administration is not proposing any measure. We have not said whether we should regulate it or not. So we explained that clear and in answer to Dr. Helena Wong's question. Now, if exit poll is carried out within the no canvassing zone, then an application must be made and a statutory declaration must be completed. That is, before the end of polling, the exit poll results must not be published. So apart from that requirement, there is no other regulation over exit polls at the moment. So if what you mentioned is not within the scope of this regulation, that means there is no regulation. Now, the public may see someone doing something openly, and then they express views on how people should vote, but we could all see that. But then at the moment, there is no regulation over that. So that's why we can discuss it. It doesn't matter which party is involved. But you've been saying all this, and you dare not give your comments on the Christopher Chong case. No, I'm talking about policy. I'm mentioning the worst example. You are talking about policy. You try to evade such bad examples. You know, you don't have the credibility to speak here. Now, I think the policy is about whether we should regulate or not. Next, Mr. Eddie Chu. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick point. I didn't hear this clearly from the Undersecretary. I don't know if he responded to Mr. Leung Kwok Hong's questions. That is, how come for election petition it could drag on for so long, and then you instead you sped through the disqualification process. Now, as the chairman, I have the duty to remind members today we are here to talk about the consultation paper on review of electoral arrangements, that is dissemination of information on the internet and so on. So I have the duty just to remind members. So Undersecretary, it's up to you how you respond to Mr. Eddie Chu's question. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chu, for the question. I understand the election petition mentioned by Mr. Leung is under processing by the court. Now, I'm sure you're going to say I'm digressing, but I'm talking about the fairness of election. Now, after election results are out and there's an election petition, could it then be dealt with within a suitably short period of time is their position on the part of the government. Now, the election was in September last year, now we're in December 2017. It's still dragging on. And then there are many in the NT-East and NT-West, and many of us members are in office, but this whole issue is not yet resolved, and then we couldn't get the subsidy back still. So it's a problem, and you are the Constitutional and Mainland Affairs Bureau. Shouldn't you just sit on your hands? Are you saying that it's normal for the court not to come up with a ruling judgment after 5.5 months? Mr. Chen, well, I believe Mr. Adichie is not suggesting that we interfere with the judiciary, but of course we would also like to see early judgment.
You say you are very anxious, you will not interfere with the court. But for this election petition, it should have been concluded within a reasonable period of time. So are you going to do something about it for the next round of election to ensure that such disputes will not drag on until the end of the term of the members? I believe the administration I think it is not for us to decide how the court will deal with this. So we really need to wait until there's a decision by the court. I'd like to remind members again, Chairman, I don't have any further questions. There is no need for you to remind me. I'm just reminding members because several members have raised such issues. I have a duty to remind members to come back to the issues on the agenda. Fernando Zhang. On the subject of exit poll, I don't think that was irrelevant. It is certainly within the scope of the Consultation paper. I think that the exit polls, especially the legitimate and academic studies like the polls conducted by the Hong Kong polling station, is very reasonable. And it is actually conducive to analyzing the trends for that election. But our laws do not allow the findings of these exit polls to be disclosed before the end of the poll. Just now, several colleagues have pointed out that some candidates, some of whom have already become members, have publicly disclosed that they did have access to information, and such information could be used for vote matching. So I understand that the enforcement authority should be the ICAC, but as the Policy Bureau, Mr. Undersecretary, I think you also have a responsibility here. First of all, such conducts are illegal and it cannot be condoned. And secondly, in respect of such cases, and there have been more than one such case, there have been only a few cases which have been publicized. For those cases which have been publicized, as the Policy Bureau, don't you have the responsibility to remind the enforcement authorities to pay attention? I think that is a basic duty of the Policy Bureau. I don't think you should evade the issue. Could the Undersecretary respond, please? Yes. I was explaining that if there's any exit poll conducted on the no canvassing zone, there are restrictions and regulations. Exit polls done outside the no canvassing zone or before polling day, at the moment there are no restrictions. So today this issue is being raised as to whether or not they should also be regulated. I don't know whether you've heard my question. Mr. Secretary, could you explain the whole, policy concept? I don't think he need to repeat that. I was asking my question, that is, as the Policy Bureau, when a public figure has publicly stated that they had access to information about the state of the election on polling day, so that during certain hours they can appeal to the voters to vote for another candidate. And that is what we mean by vote matching. It's based on the data they've collected from such exit polls. And it's very likely that there have been organizations conducting such polls, and such information has been released to these political parties. It is the ICAC which enforces the law, but it's the Policy Bureau. Don't they have a responsibility to ask the enforcement authorities to investigate into this? Under Secretary? When I've earlier already answered the question. I think the premise here is that certain organizations have breached the regulations. My answer is that there are no such regulations, so there's no question of whether there's any breach. Today we're here to discuss exactly whether there should be regulations. I thought that we already have regulations saying that that before the announcement of the polling results, such data cannot be released. Isn't that part of the current regulations? Well, of course, the organization will need to put in an application. And in 2015, we also added the requirement that the organization should make a statutory declaration promising that they will not disclose the information collected. The case you refer to happened a year ago. So you're saying that this regulation was only enacted after the Chung Shih-kan incident. After Mr. Chung's incident, had there been similar incidents? And if so, would you ask the enforcement authorities to investigate? My understanding is that we have not received such complaints. If you have any such information, you could certainly relay them to us. Mr. Undersecretary, the colleagues may not know whether that is a legal requirement or is it just a declaration that the organization concerned promised not to disclose the information. Perhaps later on you can further elaborate on this point if there is time. We now move on to the next member, Mr. Chung Kwok Kwan. When I first came in the chamber, I felt that some members are, actually blindly criticizing the DAB. I must state clearly that the DAB in past elections had never been engaged in exit polls. I hope he will really come up with, concrete evidence. He talked about something being said by a certain person, and he kept asking the secretary about that, and he quoted what somebody said, and he said that was like a golden rule, and what he said was 100% accurate. If a public figure, just because the public said something, and we have so many public figures in this council, and every day, 5 sentences out of 10 by some of the members may not be actually true. So, just now we were discussing about the exit polls on polling days, especially the Thunderbolt operation, which actually, influenced the voters, voting intention. And this is different from the exit polls. First of all, there are regulations for such exit polls. Some members pointed out that the Hong Kong youth surveys are sacred, it's inviolable. I don't know why he has such a lot of faith in this polling center. the Pan-Democrats particularly trust this polling organization. Any polls conducted by other organizations are all bad and biased. I don't know how they came to this conclusion. I think we need to be fair. If a particular organization breaches the regulations, then you can complain. You can ask the law enforcement authorities to investigate. I don't think you should say that organizations which you're friendly with, you will condone what they do, and others that you don't like, you do not. We're talking about surveys like the Thunderbolt operation. During the last election, obviously it had actually affected the election results. It's not just for the pro-government camp, but even among the Pan-Democrats, it has seriously affected the outcome of the election. And the instigator said that for the next election, he will come up with version 2.0 of that operation. Should we blindly allow that to happen and allow him to manipulate the election results? I think this is something that we need to discuss. And myself and the DAP both believe that such conduct cannot be allowed to continue. So I hope the Undersecretary and the Bureau will, going forward, come up with some measures to regulate such conduct. Otherwise, our election will lose all its credibility. Any response from the Secretary? I've heard Mr. Cheung's suggestion. He agrees that there should be regulation. We've also heard others saying that there shouldn't be regulation. Thank you.
我哋到下一位同事係啊。
Next, Mr. Cheng Chung Tai. I'm sorry I had to attend another meeting and I'm late. I understand that the focus of our discussion today is about the exit poll, and we have some arguments over that. Whether it's the Democratic camps and the pro-government camp, especially certain political figures have made some comments on the radio in a program regarding vote matching. I just want the Bureau to explain this clearly. Regarding the exit poll, at the meeting on the 13th, I think this was mentioned in that paper, we discussed whether on polling day, when exit polls are being conducted, I hope the Bureau tell us whether it has any direction. I'm in favor of banning any form of polls being conducted on polling day. At the last electoral election, I think people were making use of the loopholes to conduct to engage in conduct which affected the credibility of the election. I'm not saying we should interfere with the election. The principle should be that the Constitutional and Maintenance Affairs Bureau should try its best to maintain the integrity and the fairness of the election. I think we've discussed this issue several times already. For exit polls or election polls, what is the inclination of the Bureau? I mean, Chairman, we've heard different views on this issue today. I think the government so far doesn't have any position on this issue, and this is because this is a very important issue, the fairness of an election. But the election will need to be fair, and people will need to be satisfied that it is fair. The question asked today is whether the current regulations are sufficient, and we've heard divergent views today. For such an important topic, we think there needs to be a public consultation. We need to listen to different views, and then we analyze the views collected before we come up with a position. At the beginning, I've already said that after the end of the consultation, we will really present a report on the consultation and then submit it to this panel. At that time, we will explain to members clearly what will be our position. I think you've confused one thing. Our debate just now was about was that you were very biased in the execution of the rules. When people suggested in the open air that there have been vote matching and some organizations have complained to the ICAC, the question was why the administration did not follow up. Of course, there is question regarding bias in the execution of the rules, but the system at the moment, I mean, right now show that the exit polls really cannot catch up with the advancement of technology. If you, for example, conduct polls on the internet, so there are some gray areas that we need to address. So people on the one hand are saying that you are biased, but for the exit polls, are there any loopholes created because of the advancement of technology? So I hope the Bureau can really give us an answer as to how you can deal with those issues.
A quick response, please. We will analyze the consultation findings as soon as possible, and then we will give a report. Now, you say that the consultation is biased. I think that's a biased statement. Now, for any organization conducting polls, exit polls, the government never follow up on such cases unless there's exit polls being conducted in the no canvassing zone. Now, you mentioned words of certain political figures or other issues. We've never followed up because there is no law to follow up on, so you can't say it's biased. Mr. Ari Lee? Mr. Chairman, this is a panel. If you talk about biased Election Affairs Commission or the Bureau, we also have many grievances. But I think the public can see that for themselves. You think that the law enforcement outcome is not to their favor, of course, they would say it's biased. Now, we've got plenty of experience to share. There are people abandoning their campaign. Of course, this is not fair. And half of the time they use the election expense to canvass for another candidate. Of course, this is bias. But anyway, let's not attack each other over that. I want to talk about regulating election surveys. Now, if you ask anyone, of course, everybody will want you to do a better job in ensuring the fairness of election. But I'm not concerned. We're now using a very outdated way to regulate elections. Technology is rapidly advancing. Now, I see this operation and that operation. Probably in the future, they will make use of the Internet. But how much can you regulate, really, on the Internet? For information disseminated from overseas, can you regulate that? If you cannot regulate it, then whatever regulatory approach you comes up with, it will be neither here nor there. Now, of course, we all agree it's important to ensure the fairness of election, but I'm just worried, the Internet and so on, that we are the one put under your regulation because we observe the rules. But then if the information is disseminated from other sources, can you regulate that? So make that clear to us now. If someone's trying to help candidate in the election from overseas, can you regulate such information? On the Secretary? Thank you, Ms. Lee, for your question. You're saying that even if our intention is good, we must make sure that the law proposed is good as well. Now, if we say we're going to regulate, but we can't say exactly how we're going to regulate, maybe then there's no sense to do so. I think Ms. Starley mentions information disseminated from overseas, electronically or through social media, whatever. Now, we could come up with a workable regulatory framework. So, of course, we will need to address this point even if you don't mention it. Otherwise, it cannot be comprehensive set of regulation. Now, my view is if you want election to be fairer, everyone wants that. But I don't want you to do something. So, at the end, there are obvious loopholes. For example, I just mentioned, disseminating information through a non-local server on the internet, and that will bypass your regulation. So you have to consider that as well. If you can't do anything about it, then just don't bother. Okay, I would also like to give my views. Now, many members mentioned the Thunder Go. I think the Thunder Go is also to do with abandoning campaigns. So Thunder Go and abandoning campaigns together, they make for real unfairness in election. I said this many times at other meetings. I say you must also deal with abandoning of campaigns en masse, because then we don't know how to count the election expense. Now, I'm not going to dwell into details here. Rather, I would like to say something about dissemination of the information on the internet and counting that towards election expense. Now, in the consultation paper, it's proposed to relax the publication of candidates of election information on the social media. I think the principle is right, but I'd like to say a bit more here. In the cyber world, or it is common for people to use the social media on the phone. Someone may read a message and then forward it to others with his own comment. Now, if by adding the comment it becomes election expense, then it will be a real problem for the candidates and many others too, because no one would know what would count towards the election expense and what would not, and they may be caught by the law inadvertently. So that's why I agree you should adopt a liberal approach as far as possible. Otherwise, people don't even know. Maybe I'm just forwarding someone else's message and I add my own comment, and then somehow it becomes an election advertisement. So I don't think you should go overboard, and that's just my comment. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Chairman, for your 2 points. First, about Internet. Expressing views on the Internet, especially on social media, say friends are just having a chat. Yes, we appreciate that. That's very much part of the modern day life. So that's why in the document we propose that if there is communication of this sort, this could be exempted, so people won't be caught inadvertently. So this is a very much a targeted approach. We are talking about expenses for internet charge or electricity. So you have no ties to the candidate whatsoever. It's just about passing on information or sharing your own views. Abandoning a campaign, well, as you mentioned that on several occasions. So if you haven't heard it before, I could share with you again the government's position. What do you mean by abandoning a campaign? It's hard to define, really. The current law states that once you start running for an election, you cannot withdraw. This is to make sure the election is fair. Because then maybe some would all sign up and then they just all withdraw altogether, and that would influence affect the election, the poll results. Now, in other places, there is no so-called law over abandoning a campaign, but it's something we need to explore, and definitely it's an issue we have to tackle. Okay, now, if there are colleagues who would like to speak for a second time, yes, I could allow a second round of questions. Members, would you like to speak again? Dr. Helena Wong. Okay, 4 minutes again for the second round. Dr. Helena Wong. The DAB has been cornering the Undersecretary, asking you to regulate the practice of abandoning campaign. As we all know, it cannot be regulated because we cannot define what is meant by abandoning a campaign. Let's say someone signs up to run in the election. In the earlier part of the campaign, he was more active, and the latter part was less so. And then can you then punish him for that? Or maybe for some candidates, if soon after they declare their candidacy, they don't get much popular support, so they don't bother much with the campaign. And then it often happens. So do you call that abandoning the campaign then? So there's nothing you can do about it, really. Then I don't think you should waste any time and effort on that. So what must you do then? You look all innocent today as if you knew nothing. Maybe you're new into the Bureau. But I'm sure the REO knows this all very well. That is, during the election, there were grannies being wheeled to the polling station. I'm sure some of them were keen to vote, but some others may not be so. So you should do something about it. At least for the relevant election legislation, you should inform the elderly home operators, residents and staff, so they all know exactly what's allowed and what's not allowed. Or for example, if someone is reluctant, but still you make him go to vote, say for the DAB, definitely there is a problem, and there's something you can do about it. You can't just claim ignorance and say, well, there's not a case, or we can't investigate. Now I've run for elections at the district council, and Whampoa East, my opponent was Priscilla Leung. Now the polling station was in Whampoa Garden. How come there could be busfuls of elderly people being driven over to vote? Were they doing so voluntarily or not? But the government would not follow up, and you just say it's the ICAC. So the government is just turning a blind eye to such problems. What about the social workers, the carers, or the operators? Force the elderly to vote against the will of the elderly and their family is certainly not allowed. And also, in no canvassing zone, there are organizations which have applied in advance to conduct polls. I think you should really review the arrangement. Now, you ask them to sign a declaration on confidentiality. That is, before the end of polling, no information should be published. But it's all a matter of trust. So you take their words on trust. Just because they signed the declaration, you trust them not to breach breach their undertaking. But is there any way you could ensure that they will abide by the code? And if it's just on trust, I'm telling you, it is all too common. We know that exit poll findings have been secretly used for electioneering purpose. So it's not about policy. It's a matter of policy. It's not just about individual cases. That is, apart from the statutory declaration, are there other means for you to monitor these polling bodies? Because if you can't do anything about it, you should ban exit polls altogether, or in the no canvassing zone, so people could only do exit polls outside the polling stations, and you have to regulate anything. It's up to them what they do then. So whichever way you go, you have to give us reasons. You can't just rely on people signing declarations. Undersecretary, for elderly homes, definitely forcing people to vote is not allowed by law. But still, we're talking about cases, so if anyone has any information about a particular case, please report it. Now, if there's a group of elderly people going to vote, it doesn't mean anything. It just shows that there's a group of elderly people going to vote, and you can only speculate as to whether they are doing so voluntarily. So we need evidence, concrete evidence. And the statutory declaration, does it serve no purpose? No, there is legal liability. If you breach the declaration, we could take you to task. So that in itself is a monitoring mechanism. Now, if you do it openly, you breach the declaration openly, of course, is easy to tackle. But if it's done secretly, then how can people find out about it? But if someone does find out about it, then he must report it. So that's why I say, if you have concrete evidence, please be a good citizen and report the case. So what are we talking about here? That is, under the current mechanism, within the no canvassing zone, there's certain regulation. We want to discuss whether that regulation is sufficient or not. Now today, Dr. Wong said that if we cannot prevent any malpractices, might as well ban it altogether. So of course, that's a position too. We can look into that.
I also have a question regarding the proposal to shorten the polling hours. In the past, actually at the last meeting, someone expressed support and some were against that proposal. And some deputations today have also expressed their views on this. My observation is that, first of all, there have been some views suggesting that the polling hours now is too long. If you say there is no room at all to slightly shorten the polling hours, I don't think that is reasonable. At least there should be room for discussion to see whether there could be some adjustments. And on that basis, because you're talking about a very long period, and if people have to, if the staff, if they have to work very long hours and they have to work until late in the evening and then they have to work even longer, so we may need to take care of the needs of these staff, and I think that is necessary. As to how we should shorten the polling hours and by how much, this is certainly something we can express our views. Well, that is my preliminary opinion. But I would like to ask the Under Secretary this question. You're saying that regarding the proposal to shorten the polling hours, do you have any particular, position? How long do you think the polling hours should be shortened, and how do you propose to do that? Thank you. On polling hours, let's first of all look at the facts. And perhaps I can go into more details here. In the consultation paper, we refer to several jurisdictions. And there are some jurisdictions with polling hours of 12 hours and some with 10 hours. We have polling hours, 15 polling hours. We are actually longer than those other jurisdictions. Do we need to maintain such long polling hours? Now, we have an open mind, but in analyzing this question, we've also stated in 4.09 that if there is a consensus in society that we need to slightly shorten the polling hours, for example, cutting the polling hours by 1 hour or half an hour, we will be happy to refer this proposal to the REO for a detailed discussion. This is an administrative measure. If we have a mature discussion, then we can actually implement the revision without having to amend the rules. We can certainly discuss the duration of the polling hours. As I said, it's not easy to change the habit, but then we can slowly change the habit. And We are now proposing a very moderate proposal, and we were just asking whether or not this is feasible. Priscilla Leung. In para 2.07 and 2.09 of the consultation paper, you said that expressing personal opinion on the Internet, if it satisfies the requirements, that it will not be in breach of the ordinance. I think that is too abstract. In any election, we all know that you need to be specific about certain things. Either you take the negative approach. That is, if anything happens, only then would it be a breach of the election rules. Don't say if the conditions are satisfied, because you are allowing too much discretion, and this will result in a lot of political bickering. On 2.07, apparently you are not too sure as to how. Say, for example, when someone disseminates some information to prevent a candidate from being elected, if you, in future, you were to come up with some policy guidelines, you need to be more precise. Or what you say here is too broad. It's not clear enough. Dr. Helena Wong referred to Whampoa East, so I must respond to her allegation and ask what basis does she have in making that allegation. In Whampoa East, myself, I think there have been several Kai Fongs who were registered residents of Whampoa East, but they went to the Hoi Sum Park polling station to vote. Technically, at the moment, we cannot really protect our voters. Of course, in the end, those voters could not cast their votes, but I did not follow further on that. But such conduct or behavior, I think you should really try to investigate. On dissemination of information on the Internet, we now have to rely on Yahoo or Google. And on several occasions, during the peak of the election period, we're not able to disseminate information, and we were sent a message saying that somebody claimed that they've received messages from you and complained, therefore we won't allow you to disseminate any further information. In the end, I have to complain to the United States and asking whether they're interfering with what we do, because if the residents give us the email address, you can't stop us from sending emails to those people. For a couple of days, I was not allowed to disseminate our election information because we have to do it through websites which are controlled by people outside of Hong Kong. So I wonder whether we can have something in Hong Kong that can protect all the candidates. How would I know whether people in other jurisdictions have certain political biases, and once they receive a complaint, they will ban me from using the emailing system? I think this is something that you should, look at seriously. Next, on the subject of exit poll, like Thunder Go, I think in Macau they also have a similar project. And everybody has become victims. Now, according to my observation, even for the pan-Democrat camps, you have a new candidate who received suddenly the highest number of votes. So I think that is not fair. We need a cooling off period. I don't think the exit polls should be allowed to be manipulated by certain people, so that the candidates are like their puppets. So they're saying that, and then the votes can be, manipulated, and because that is very unfair to the candidates. So I think we definitely need to consider setting a cooling off period. Finally, on polling hours, I think we need to be very careful here. I think we need to conduct further consultation. It all depends on the views of the public. For those of us who contest for election, we'll be at the station until 10:30. But for the working staff, sometimes they need to cast the votes early. Some people can only cast the votes after they finish with the work. So how do you accommodate the needs of these people, and so that they wouldn't lose the right to vote just because you've shortened the polling hours? So I have an open mind here. You can slightly shorten the polling hours, but you certainly have to, conduct some surveys to find who are the people who would cast their votes during those hours, or do they cast their hours during those hours because they need to go to work and so on. So I hope you'll follow up on those points. Could the Secretary respond to the question about the overseas internet or website? Regarding could you please speak in the microphone, please? Regarding the case involving the overseas website, I would like to ask whether the REO has anything to add. Ms. Leung asked several questions. First of all, the regulation of election advertisements online. And in the consultation paper, we talk about the present arrangement. But in the end, we said we are proposing or advocating one option. Now, at the moment, unless you are a candidate or the election expense agent, otherwise you cannot incur any election expenses, and other people cannot advertise on your behalf. Right now in the social media, the sharing of opinion, transmission of opinion is not. It's nothing to do with the candidates. If you take a like or give your approval, I mean, regarding such chats online as election advertisements will result in many people breaching the law, and we want to deal with this issue. Our proposal now is very clear. So long if a third party on election day express an opinion or attitude on the internet and have exchanges of such nature on the internet, then the internet charges and electricity charges incurred will not count as the part of the election expenses, and as a result they will not inadvertently break the law. So this is how we propose to address the issue. I note that you are in support of a cooling off period, and on polling hours you're saying that so long as you can address the needs of people who need to work long hours, you have an open mind. And you are prepared to accept, the shortening of polling hours. We'll bear that in mind. We have 15 polling hours, but it's not the case that many people have worked 15 hours a day. So is it that the issue cannot be addressed? And is it really impossible for the people who need to go to work to take a short break to come and vote? So in future, we will liaise more with the employer associations and ask them to, for example, make arrangements with the employee so that so long as the work is not interfered with, the operation of the company is not interfered with, then there are ways to address the issue. Mr. Wong will supplement on the point about the overseas website. I think Ms. Leung was referring to some individual ISPs which have already set a limit on the volume of emails that can be dispatched. Before the election, we already reminded the candidates that if they needed to send out large number of emails to their constituents, they can liaise with the internet service suppliers to see whether or not they can give them a bigger quota. Otherwise, they will follow the practice of the ISP, and it's likely that the emails will be blocked. Our practice is that we would, chop up the information we need to send out because, sorry, half a minute. I must clarify this. You can follow up. I don't expect an answer. I think the problem is not that the message is too long. they're saying that they have received a complaint. It could have been just complained by one person, and then they have the excuse to ban us. And I think this is really serious, right? Oh, this is actually data from the REO. And secondly, you need to follow up on the Whampoa East voters. They were able to vote at the Hoi Sum polling station. So I hope you will follow on that.
Last member to speak would be Mr. Horace Zhang. After that, meeting will come to an end. Mr. Horace Zhang, please. Thank you. About some, publicity on the internet. Paragraph 8. Is this information from the Secretariat? Anyway, doesn't matter. I think it's the same, point in the official document. And how do we tell whether it's election advertisement? Let's say netizens just want to comment on something or share some publicity materials, then usually that will not be regarded as election advertisement. But if that person does so under the instructions of the candidate or his campaigning team, and trying to promote the election of the candidate, then they will be regarded as an election advertisement. So that's the definition given in the document. But I'm concerned that it could be too vague. That is, giving personal views, that's not an election advertisement. But if you do so on the instructions of the election team, then that counts as election advertisement. Let's say I send out publicity video and someone say that, this is the Kennedy of Hong Kong, so that's a compliment, right? And that's actually just that person's view. But would it be regarded as promoting the election of their candidate? Because after reading that, I might say, okay, in Hong Kong we never have someone like Kennedy. Now this person is running here, of course, I need to support him. So would that be promoting the election of that person, and therefore this message is regarded as election advertisement? Could the Bureau give specific answer, please? Bureau, please. It's about information on the internet, because everyone is worried. If it's just a comment, maybe it's fine, but maybe if it's turned around in a way, then you would say it's a breach of the law or whatever. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Zhang, for your question. Oh, you are attentive to details. Here, our what we propose to relax is rather specific. Let's say if you're not the candidate or you're not on the team of the electioneering team, and then you give certain views or make certain comments on the internet, then the internet charges and the electricity tariff would not be counted towards election expense, so you will not therefore be caught by the law. So it's this specific. Now, but the question is, what is election advertisement? That's really your question. Now, what we are not changing the definition of election advertisement. It's clear in the law. That is, there has to be intent, and that's the purpose test. In other words, the purpose is to promote or prejudice the election of a candidate. So the form does not matter. It could be in any form as long as there is the purpose. So your intention is disseminating information is to promote or prejudice the election of a candidate. Then that will count as election advertisement. So we have to consider whether the dissemination of the information would have this consequence. Now, your example could be controversial. The Kennedy, everyone may have a different regard of him, and so we have to therefore consider whether there is a purpose of doing so. That's really the key. Well, in that case, I think all members have had the chance to ask questions. Next item on the agenda, any other business? There is nothing on the AOB, so I adjourn the meeting. Thank you all. Members and deputations for coming to the meeting. Thank you.